I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's important discussion on Jewish refugees after the Holocaust. Telling stories is what we do at the museum, and so many of the stories that we tell sort of end in 1945, or the way we tell them ends in 1945. And but the real lived stories of survival did not end in 1945. Many were in Europe for several years while they figured out where to go next in their life, and they experienced challenges and joys and successes while they were there. So that's the story that we're here tonight to discuss, the experience of the refugees and displaced persons after the Holocaust. We have three excellent guests here tonight to help us understand this topic a little bit better. Have David Nasaw, a historian and author of the recently released book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. It's an excellent read and an overview of the topic, and we really encourage you to order it. We also have on the panel Esther Safran Foer, author of I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a Post-Holocaust Memoir, which is another excellent book released last year and includes the story of her family's years in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And our moderator this evening is Joseph Berger, longtime New York Times reporter and editor who authored an account of his own family's experiences titled Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust. You can order all three of their books at the links in the Zoom chat. While we get into the discussion this evening, please feel free to share any questions and comments in the Zoom Q&A box or the chat, and we'll leave some time towards the end for audience Q&A. Without further ado, a warm welcome, Esther, David, and Joe. Joe, feel free to kick us off.
Okay. Thank you for inviting us. When Americans think of the end of World War II, they tend to recall those euphoric scenes in a crowded Times Square of soldiers and sailors and civilians embracing and kissing and whooping up in a blizzard of confetti, then resuming life as before. But the end of the war in Europe was far grimmer than such celebratory scenes. More than 10 million people had been displaced from their homes and communities. While most were able to return once the fighting stopped and some semblance of authority was restored, more than 1 million were unable to go back. Their families had been murdered, their villages and neighborhoods had been destroyed, and they themselves were in mourning and emotional distress, confused about what the future held for them and who they would spend it with. Many were also unwilling to live under communist rule in the lands the Soviet Union occupied or effectively controlled. More than 200,000 of these were Jews, many emaciated and sickly, who had suffered terribly in concentration camps or hidden in bunkers or dugouts by Christian acquaintances, or had posed as Christians. The victorious Allies kept many of them at first in the very Nazi camps where they had been enslaved and persecuted, or in the German military barracks. The refugees languished in these camps for years, 5 or more in most cases, waiting for the passage of bills in a reluctant Congress that would pry open the national quotas to admit these DPs, or for Britain to let them into Mandate Palestine. It's an often ugly story that David Nasaw has definitively told, and I mean definitively, in the Last Million, and that Esther Safran Foer, mother of all the writing Safran Foers, lived as an infant in DP camps and reconstructed for a memoir describing her search for the full story of her parents' lives. I too spent 4 years in DP camps in Germany and can talk about that and about our early years as refugees in the United States. So let me start with Esther. Esther and I were toddlers, as Esther says. From our point of view, life was good. We were with our parents. We were ignorant of what they had been through. Esther tells us about it. Esther, tell us about your family situation at the end of the war, what you remember about the DP camps, and what you later learned about what it must have been like for your parents.
So my parents were Holocaust survivors, and of course, with that comes a lot of scary stories, a lot of horrors that I didn't know about growing up because, like many Holocaust survivors, they were trying to protect me. And the interesting thing is I have this birth certificate, and it said I was born in Ziegenheim, Germany, September the 8th, 1946. And that's always been one of the puzzles in my life, one of the many unanswered questions, because in fact, I wasn't born in Germany, and I wasn't born in Ziegenheim, and I wasn't born on September the 8th. I never understood until I researched this book, the background of what was going on during this period, why my father created this falsehood. In fact, I was born in Lodz, Poland in 1946. My parents, as refugees from the East, kept moving west, as did many of the refugees who were survivors. They had no family to go back to, no homes to go back to, nothing. And they were trying to figure out what to do with their lives. My parents married in Lodz, Poland. By the way, on Lag BaOmer, which we just celebrated and also just saw a terrible tragedy. And they stayed in Lodz, or Łódź, depending on where you come from, how you say it. They stayed there for a little over a year, and I was born there in 46. I have some lovely pictures of my father and I in our apartment, an apartment that was fully furnished with lovely furniture, pictures on the wall, tablecloths that had all been left by another Jewish family that was not coming back to live there, that had no doubt been murdered. And at some point, my father started hearing, as did lots of the other refugees, it's time to get out of Poland. There were pogroms in Poland after the war, there were murders. So like lots of other Jews, we were trying to figure out how to make our way out. And by the way, this was exactly as the Iron Curtain was coming down. And as I was told the story by my mother, we went from Poland into Germany, into the American zone for DP camps, because that we understood was our best way out of Europe. We did it in a covered truck with apparently a false bottom. I was 6 months old. My mother had to put cloth in my mouth so that I wouldn't cry during the most dangerous parts of the trip. We went, the first camp, the camp we spent the most time in is in Ziegenheim. As you mentioned, these DP camps were put in any edifice that could hold people, including former concentration camps. In our case, it was a former POW camp. So they threw out the Russian POWs and put the Jewish refugees in. The camp was a mess. There were no facilities. We were living in army barracks. But as you mentioned, when I look at my pictures, and they're not real, I don't know that they're memories triggered by stories or pictures. I was a cute little toddler, loved by two adoring parents. I was their, gateway into the future.
It's interesting, Esther. We have similar stories. My folks, after spending the war years in Russia, came back to Poland thinking that was where they were going to live. Mm-hmm. And they were outside Warsaw, and looking for relatives, which of course they didn't find.
And of course,
they're outside Warsaw, and they heard about the pogrom in Kielce, where something like 43 or 45 Jews were killed as a result of a blood libel, aided by the police in Poland. So my father said, "We're getting out of here," and they sold all their belongings, found their way onto some kind of smuggling route, and took a truck to Germany, where the Allies had set up the DP camps, and we ended up in Schlachtensee, outside Berlin, believe it or not. So it's interesting that and also when you talk about false papers, we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Yes,
we have similar stories there too. So David, what was the challenge the Allies faced at the end of the European War, and how well would you say they handled it at the beginning?
At the very beginning, when the war is over, there are 8 to 10 million foreigners in Germany. None of them wanted to be there. They had been brought in. There were millions of POWs, political prisoners. There were at least 1 million, probably more, Ukrainians and Poles who had been literally kidnapped by the Nazis, brought into Germany to do the jobs that the soldiers who were on the Eastern Front had once done. Without these foreign laborers, the Germans called them guest laborers, but they were slave laborers. The German economy would have fallen apart during the war, and no one in Germany, the soldiers, would have had anything to eat. There were also at least a couple 100,000 Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians who had come into Germany at the end of the war. Why? Because they had collaborated, many of them, with the Nazis. And they were afraid that once the war was over and the Nazis lost, they would be tried for their crimes and sent into exile or worse. So they escaped at the end of the war. They came voluntarily into Germany to save their lives. The last group were the Jews. As the war came to an end, the Nazis realized that the last thing they wanted was for the world to know the crimes against humanity that they had perpetrated. The last thing they wanted the world to know was about the death camps and the concentration camps. So they rounded up the survivors and they trucked them to train stations and they sent them by train into Germany. The Nazis did this in 1944 and 1945, not to save Jewish lives, but to kill the Jews in a different way. Rather than waste them by killing them in gas chambers, they would bring them to Germany and work them to death for the Reich. When the war was over, 20 to 40,000 Jewish survivors were liberated from their camps, from Dachau and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and Ohrdruf. And they were liberated by the Allies and they were put into a new sort of camp, displaced persons camp. And the Allies did not recognize such a thing as the Jewish people. So if you were a Polish Jew, you were put into a camp with Polish non-Jews, many of whose families had probably taken away your property. If you were a Lithuanian Jew, and there weren't a lot of them survivors, if you were a Lithuanian Jew, you ended up with Lithuanians, some of whom might have been auxiliary policemen who killed your relatives. That was the beginning of the journey of the last million. In the beginning, in May and June and July, there were maybe 30, 40,000 Jews. A year later, there were 250,000. Why? Because Joe's family and Esther's family had been saved because they had crossed the borders into the Soviet Union. 80 to 90% of the Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust did so because they had crossed the borders into the Soviet Union and they had worked at hard labor for 4 years. When the war was over, they came back to Poland. Stalin provided the trains to bring them back to Poland, and they discovered, to their horror, that they were not wanted, that anti-Semitism in Poland after the war was more virulent, more violent, more murderous than before the war. The Poles had learned the wrong lesson from the Nazi occupation. And what they said to Joe's family, the Poles, and to Esther's family was, you don't belong here anymore. This is not your country. We thought you were dead. And Esther's family and Joe's family collected all their belongings. They pawned whatever they had. They took the clothes on their backs and maybe a valise each. And with the help of Brika, which was a Jewish organization, and with the help of the Jewish Agency, and because the American soldiers looked the other way, they began the long journey, the journey that had begun in the Asiatic reaches of the Soviet Union. They began the long journey into Germany. And this is the irony of irony, the tragic irony that we don't know about as part of our history as Jews, as Americans, as human beings, that the only safe place on earth, certainly in Europe, for the Jewish survivors was in camps in Germany, the land of their murderers, where they would be guarded in those camps by American soldiers.
Now, at first, the conditions were pretty awful, as you describe them in your book. And then they cleared up when they sent an emissary, Earl Harrison, who was an official at was it Pennsylvania University?
Yeah, University of Pennsylvania Law School.
Penn, yeah.
And also appeals from the Jewish military chaplains, who played an enormous role as well. But that did not make it easier to come over. Why was that?
Well,
When I say come over to immigrate to America,
Yeah.
you would think, David, you would think, given the fact that the survivors could not get into America before the war, they couldn't get into America during the war, you would think that after the war, the Americans would say, you know, beat their chest and slachli, whatever, to use the Hebrew. They would say, you know, we goofed, but now you can all come in. That is not what happened.
No, it's not what happened. And this is the hidden history, of the Jewish people. This is the hidden history of American immigration and American government. This is the hidden history of the Holocaust. That when the war is over, I'm a historian by trade. I'm also a Jew. I did not know this story. I somehow assumed that although Roosevelt and the White House had done nothing to save the 6 million, and they had reasons for not doing that. They said, we've got to win the war. I had assumed that when the war was over, the American Congress and the American people would say to the Jewish survivors, you've suffered enough, that the American people would open their hearts, their wallets, their gates, and say, come, you know, seek refuge here. But no, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. The political system, I think, broke down. The Congress was dominated by a coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans. And they didn't want the Jews. They didn't want any displaced persons. They didn't want any Eastern Europeans, but they especially did not want the Jews. And why? Well, there are a variety of reasons. Anti-Semitism was recoded into a new language. And the senators and the congressmen said, almost directly, all of these Jews came from Russia or they came from Poland. Russia and Poland are dominated by the Soviets. Every Jew who wants to come here is a subversive. The congressmen, with the help of the press and the State Department, promulgated one of the old myths, the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that had been a staple of Hitler's ideology. And they said that all Jews are Bolsheviks and all Bolsheviks are Jews. The Pope had said that after World War I. It was absolutely absurd. It was ridiculous, but it was said enough times. It was the big lie, and the big lie won, and the Jews were kept out. Let me read something if I can. This is from Ed Lee Gossett of Texas. He says the displaced persons camps, the camps where Esther's family was and Joe's family were, they are filled with bums, criminals, subversives, revolutionists, crackpots, and human wreckage. There can be no doubt, but many of those registered as DPs awaiting passage to America have been schooled in subversive activities and seek entry here to serve foreign ideologies. John Rankin of Mississippi says on the floor of the Congress, and no one interrupts him, no one except a couple of Jewish congressmen from New York say this is, call him out as a liar. John Rankin says, I believe you're getting ready to bring into this country through the DP camps, a gang of well-trained communists and representatives of the Comintern who will spread out over this country for the purpose of plotting the overthrow of the government. 90% of the members of the Communist Party in this country are members of the racial minority groups. 60% of them are immigrants. And then he also came up with a figure, 70% of communists, members of the Communist Party in the United States, he said, spoke Yiddish as their first language. You know, I mean, we can laugh about it today, but this is no laughing matter for the Jews, for the 250,000 Jews who are stuck in the displaced persons camps for 3 to 5 years after the end of the war.
We'll talk in a minute about how they fixed in 1948 the first Displaced Persons Act to make sure that nobody who had been in Russia could get in. We'll talk about that in a minute. Sorry for the laughter, but it's an old family tradition. We laugh at painful incidents. Esther, your parents were among those excluded since
Right.
your mother had been in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
What was her story? Tell us a little bit about it, including the episode about Pesha and the shoes. So.
Oh, wow. Yes, that's sort of a legendary story in our family. My mother was one of a handful of people from her shtetl. It was a shtetl of about 5,000 people, of whom half were Jewish. She was one of 3 daughters. Her mother was a widow. They see the Germans approaching, they hear the noise, people are gathered in the main square, they're trying to figure out what to do. What do I do? And of course, terrible things had happened to Jews in Poland before, and you know, somehow they think they'll survive. But my mother and 4 other young women, these were sort of late teens, early 20s, 5 girls, sort of gathered in the main square and said, we're going to get out of here. We'll come back in a few weeks, a month, you know, when everything's better. My mother was also a bit of a rebel. And she'd actually worked for the Russians. So they would have wanted to keep her out, but they didn't succeed. So she felt that, you know, if they were going to look for people to single out, she and some of her friends would be singled out. They would have more trouble than everybody else. So she went to her house. She grabbed, this was June, the Germans are approaching. She grabbed her winter coat and a pair of scissors and 1 change of clothes. Of course, she probably didn't have too many other changes of clothes. And she went to the main square with her friends. And her younger sister, Pesha, ran after her. And she said, you're so lucky to be leaving. Pesha was 15, 16, and she took off her shoes and gave them to my mother. And my mother took off with her friends and almost instantly lost one of the shoes. And that is a story that's told over and over again in our family. My mother was Eastern European, superstitious, and that was just not a good omen. I was going to say one more thing about the camps, in addition to what David said. Not only were they dirty and terrible facilities, the American soldiers were not real sympathetic to the Jews. This was the soldiers who had won the war, who had maybe seen what happened in the camps, had seen, you know, rescued Jews out of the concentration camps, had gone home, and they were replaced by this new group of young enlisted men. And the two of them who wrote, two young Jewish enlisted guys wrote a book. Well, one of them wrote the book ultimately called Surviving the Americans. The Americans who came were also anti-Semitic. They looked at these people who had survived everything that anybody could possibly imagine, and they weren't sympathetic. The Jews were trying to rebuild their lives, and they weren't interested in listening to the authorities. And the General Patton in his diary wrote that the Jews were a subhuman race.
Vermin. He said, used the word vermin.
Yeah, this is maybe a different quote, but they were not well liked necessarily by the soldiers. The Jewish soldiers, there's stories of when the Jewish soldiers went to a Yom Kippur service that some of the refugees were holding and smuggled food in their coats and were arrested by some of the other soldiers for smuggling food to the Jewish DPs.
You know, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was gonna add to that. Eisenhower comes out as a good man here, as a good guy, and Eisenhower eventually has to fire Patton. And I think one of the reasons he fires him was that he just can't stand being around him. At a moment in time after after Earl Harrison comes back, the emissary, and says to Truman, "We are treating the Jews just the way the Germans did, except we're not exterminating them." Truman gets in touch with Eisenhower, and he says to Eisenhower, "You got to do something about this." Eisenhower visits the camps, and he attends Yom Kippur services as a sign of his solidarity. And General Patton accompanies him. And General Patton writes in his diary, quote, "We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking bunch of humanity I have ever seen. The smell was so terrible that I almost fainted, and actually about 3 hours later lost my lunch as a result of remembering it. The displaced person, some think, is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals."
What are we going to do when we see the George Scott film after
Yeah.
knowing this?
Yeah.
That somehow didn't make it into the film, did it?
No, it didn't make it into the film.
Now, the Congress, under pressure, does come up with a bill in 1948 to admit the DPs. David,
Right.
tell us just briefly how it was designed specifically to keep out Jews.
Well, it was designed in a very clever fashion. After we had defeated, I mean, the ironies are incredible. We had defeated Hitler. We had defeated a man who stood for racial prejudice, racial discrimination, for the death of those who were not Aryans. And yet this country was the army was as racist, the nation was as anti-Semitic as before. In 1948, June of 1948, 3 years after the end of hostilities in Germany, Congress passes a law, finally. And the law is written in such a way that 200,000 visas will be available. The priority will be given to those whose country has been taken over, annexed by another country. In other words, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians, among whom are the largest number of war criminals and collaborators. The law is also written to give 40% of those visas to farmers, when Congress had data that only 4% of the Jews were farmers. And maybe 2 or 3% of the Jews came from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, because the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians had very effectively murdered Jews in the killing fields. But to make sure those 2 provisions kept out Jews, but to make absolutely sure that they were kept out, another provision said that no one who was not in the camps as of December 1945 would be allowed to get a visa. 90% of the Jews, like your two families, came in after December of 1945. Fortunately, there were forgers available in every one of the camps. And those forgers rewrote the papers for families, I think, like the Bergers and like the Foers.
Definitely my family. I mean, you know, I'm an undocumented immigrant. I have to admit it right here.
So
Tell your story about where
my parents destroyed all evidence of their documents in Russia, and basically said I was born in Poland, in a barn. You know, gave me a bit of a Jesus Christ complex. I discovered this. I thought my entire youth that I was born in Poland, and I discovered this when I was applying to Columbia Journalism School, and I needed some citizenship papers for the application. And I came across this document that indicated my parents had been married 3 years after I was born. I confronted them, you know, not wanting to be what this implied. And they told me, don't worry, you're legitimate. And they finally told me the story. I was 21 years old. I got the wrong country. Daniela Gerson wrote an op-ed piece the other day in the Times, a lovely piece, where her father, Alan Gerson, who was the lawyer who got the money for the Lockerbie families, and anyway, because his father tried to get into a particular DP camp where the conditions were good, he had to take on a different identity. He became Alan Bloomstein. I forget his first name, but the family used the name Bloomstein. They came into this country using Bloomstein, and for Alan, for the first 6 years of his life in this country, went around as a guy named Bloomstein. Right. And everybody had stories like this. I know a young woman I grew up with, whose mother on her deathbed would not tell her that she was born in the Soviet Union because they lied coming into this country. They thought they would be deported.
Right.
So these are the kinds of stories that we had to live through because of what our parents were forced to do as a result of that bill. But because my parents did that, they got in 1950, early in March 1950. Esther, what did you discover about your father's experience during the war?
So we, well, I was going to say, just to follow, we got in under this totally anti-Semitic 1948 DP Immigration Act. And it was only in writing this book and reading about what was going on in that period that I understood why I have a birth certificate that says I was born in a different country on a different day. If my parents had said that I was born in Poland in 46, it would have been clear that they weren't in Germany by December of 45, which is the date that was set by the US Congress in order to keep Jewish refugees like my parents out. My birth certificate was was produced in Ziegenheim, Germany. It has a notary republic sign on it. I don't know how my father got it, but I have multiple copies. I also found a document which I only began to understand now as I'm learning about what's going on in the camps, in the immigration laws, that my father was certified as a first-class farmer. I mean, it's like an official document certifying him as a farmer. He was not a farmer. There were, I mean, as David just said, maybe 4% of the Jews were farmers. He was certified as one of them. So with these two documents, we were able to get into the US.
You know, the funny thing is my father was a farmer. He didn't take advantage of this.
Yeah. So it was interesting. When I was writing this book, I was telling some friends, my husband happens to be a lawyer, and I was telling some friends of ours, that I was writing the book. I was going to give remarks in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and the rabbi's husband, who is a very prominent lawyer, knew my story. He said, "You cannot say that publicly. You have to understand the implications of saying that you came here with false documents." And ultimately, I talked to a leading immigration lawyer that some of my friends set me up with to understand what my risks were. And it was a very interesting conversation. This, of course, is during the Trump administration. And this lawyer in Cleveland, who was head of the Immigration Lawyers Association, said, "I'm not going to tell you that you're not without risk."
The only way that the Jews are able to overcome the big lie, which is the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, is to tell little lies. And even with this Jewish ingenuity, in the end of the 200 to 250,000 Jewish DPs, only about 55,000 of them get these special visas. In the end, there are 400,000. The law is amended in 1950, and 400,000 visas are given. 55,000 Jews come. The rest of the Jews, the 150 to 200,000, go to Israel. Now, large numbers, now with a couple of thousand to Australia, a couple of thousand to Canada, some to Latin American nations, but not large numbers. And the reason they go to Israel, many of them are Zionists, but many more who had suffered through World War and the camps. The last thing they wanted was to go in 1948 and 1949 to a country at war. But they had no choice. Some of them came into the United States from Israel at a later date. But in the period we're talking about, 3 out of 4 of those displaced persons went to Israel because there was no place else for them in the world.
I want to talk a bit about the DPs and their years in those DP camps, because we have this picture of people spending as refugees, spending their time hanging laundry. You see these film clips on NBC and CNN and all that, hanging laundry and idling around campfires. The Jews in the Jewish DPs didn't just idle. They built synagogues. They started schools that had some 12,000 students, according to one figure I read. They gave opera and theater performances. They had boxing matches. My friend Simon's father was a boxer. They married and had children, and that's not to be anticipated necessarily, because many people felt that how could you bring children into a world that countenanced the Holocaust? I mean, Elie Wiesel, who I'm writing a bio of him, he put off getting married for that reason, because he felt he didn't want to bring children into a world that countenanced the Holocaust. But the DPs, they were hungry to resume their lives. They wanted to get to have children, to have families, to have some affection in their lives. And there's a touching story about a woman named Lily Friedman, who survived Bergen-Belsen, whose husband to be secured a parachute from a German airman. And she paid a dressmaker to take that parachute and turn it into a wedding dress. And that wedding dress was used by 20 other brides
Mhm.
That's how fervent the DPs were about getting married. In fact, the photographs my parents have of the DP camps are full of children.
Right.
And I read somewhere that the DP camps were the most fertile place on earth
Right,
They had,
right.
for a few years.
there was, it had the highest birth rate of any place in the world.
Any place in the world, right?
Rebuilding their lives. They were looking forward. After this incredible tragedy, they were looking for rebirth and creating, as Joe said, these operas and these yeshivas and these mikvahs and schools and camps for kids. In some ways, this was a rebirth.
Well, it had to be a rebirth. I mean, your parents and the other displaced persons, they did two things at the same time, which is remarkable. They mourned the dead. They never forgot the dead.
Right.
But they never allowed that mourning to take over their lives, because they knew that they had a tremendous responsibility. They were the surviving remnant. They were the last Jews in Europe, and they had to rebuild a community. They had to make sure that Hitler did not win. And how do you do that? You do that by keeping your religion alive. You do that by keeping Yiddish alive. You do that by keeping culture alive. You do that by keeping your dances and your music and your boxing and your chess alive. You do that by raising and educating your children. You do that by marrying and having children.
Right.
You look at the camps, pictures of the camps and their baby carriages. Everywhere.
My mother used to tell this story at, she would regale us with a lot of her stories later in life. She didn't tell stories early on. And it was right after the war, 44, she went back to her shtetl, where her sister Pesha was gone, her mother was gone. She saw someone wearing her sister Lifsh's dress. And there was a neighbor, a kind neighbor, who took her and her friend in and gave them food. I mean, these women were hungry. And my mother said to her grandchildren, "But I didn't eat." And one of her grands says, "You didn't eat? You were hungry, right? Why didn't you eat?" And she said, and then he looks at her, he says, "Because it was pork." And she said, "If nothing matters, there's nothing to save."
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. The story that I was honored to tell in my book is about this remarkable generation. And when you think of the pain and the suffering, and when you think about what was in the back of their minds, when you think of their memories, and these were young people. These were people, the survivors were in their 30s, their 20s, their 30s. One of the things that happened in the camps was, and this is another stain on the INS, in the camps, survivors, men who had lost their wives, wives who had lost their husbands, married. Cousins were taken in by distant cousins and became their children. Right. The Americans wrote a regulation. They changed the laws so that adopted children were not allowed into the United States on DP visas, because they knew that they only, what they called natural born children. I mean, this is a shanda, this is a crime. But the survivors, the first generation, had an enormous responsibility. And the second generation, your generation, picked up that responsibility. Some right away, others later, but they knew that it was the responsibility for keeping the Jewish people alive was, was handed down from generation to generation. So these are two remarkable generations, the generation of the survivors and the survivors' children.
Well, what's also interesting, David, is when the survivors come over to America, yes, and they start out with very little. They got some help from agencies like the Joint and Hayas, but they were on their own. There was no, there were no welfare programs the way we have today. They were on their own. They had to find jobs. They had to find ways to support their families, put food on the table, and they did remarkably well. So many of the survivors' children, have gone on to become doctors and lawyers and writers and all
Newspaper
kinds of good
editors.
things. I sometimes every once in a while there'll be a profile of someone, and I'm so amazed that that's a survivor's child. Daniel Liebskin is a survivor's kid.
Right.
Wolf Blitzer is a survivor's kid. Max Frankel is a survivor's kid. They did amazingly well. In fact, William Helmreich, who died of COVID, unfortunately, last year, and he was a friend, wrote a book about where he actually surveyed the survivors and their children, and found out that the survivors themselves did as well as other Jewish Americans. They entered the middle class, and had better rates of, in terms of all kinds of sociopathy than Americans, than
Right.
so-called Americans, and so that it's a story of human resilience that is very, very impressive.
I end my book with the story of Itzik and Lola Lachman, who met when they were 15 and 16 years old in Poland, outside Warsaw, at a summer resort that Jews visited, and then met again in Dachau, and then at Feldafing. And I met them in an old age home in Little Neck, and he was 97, 98. She was a year younger. And at the end of this interview, she can't talk about anything that happened to her children because she lost her twin sister at Dachau. Itzik lost his whole family, but he talks about what happened. And they were allowed to come to the United States. They snuck in, and cousins found them a place to live and a job for him. And he looked at me at the end of this interview, after having been in all sorts of camps and survived because he was a locksmith and the Germans wanted his skills. And he looked at me and he said, "It's a good life. It's a good life." He said, "I've been married for 70 years. I have wonderful children and grandchildren." He said, "It's a good life." And, I almost melted there before him. And he had a tear in his eye. But he meant what he said.
Yeah.
What remarkable people these are.
Well, David, thank you. It's a lovely story. And I think we would want to have some of the people in the audience ask some questions as well. Ari, do you want to take over?
Sure. Hi. It's been so fascinating and moving to listen to you guys. There's a lot of questions, so I'll try to sort of group them. The first question I want to ask is, for any of you, although David, you may know the most, someone has pointed out that you were talking about all these specific regulations regarding immigration and resources available. How did survivors find out about what was available to them? Were there newspapers that were distributing this information? Were there leaflets that the Allies dropped on the DP camps?
Yeah, the DP camps were filled with newspapers in English, German, French, Yiddish, Russian, Polish. And the Highest and the Joint Distribution Committee came into the camps. They came a little bit late because the Americans wouldn't let them in. They came into the camps and they took care of spreading this information. I'll tell you the story of Itzik. How did Itzik find his cousin? A Jewish chaplain at Feldafing came up to Itzik and said, do you have any relatives in, anywhere? And he said, yeah, I think I have some cousins in Brooklyn. So the chaplain said, well, what are their names? And the chaplain wrote an open letter and he sent it to all the Yiddish newspapers in New York, including the Forward, and the relatives in the diaspora of Jews looking for them to see who was alive, read these columns, and they got in touch with the chaplain who got in touch with Itzik. And when he came to the United States eventually, took care of him.
By the way, there were 70 newspapers published in the DP camps, according to my friend Sam Norwich. Can you imagine those skeletons that came out of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, publishing and editing and writing newspapers? 70 of them. Amazing feat.
Well, Joe, you follow in their footsteps as well. It's amazing. Barbara and some other audience members have asked questions about their own families' stories, trying to understand who was where and how people found each other. I'm wondering, Esther and Joe, you both wrote books about your family's experiences. What research tips do you have for our audience?
For me, the first tip was to get as much as you can firsthand. If there's somebody who still is alive to tell the story, I would ask questions everywhere I went. I would find people, not necessarily intentionally, it's kind of came together. It was kind of serendipity. But when I was in Israel, I would meet with survivors from the shtetls that my parents came from. In Brazil, I met my father's partners in Lodz. So it's tough. I mean, certainly there are a lot of databases and they're somewhat helpful, but the best information I got was from talking to people and getting their stories. And I learned a really important tip. I was looking for information about my father, and I was using his first and last name, his Yiddish first name, but his last name. In the shtetls, everybody had a nickname. And it was once I learned what his nickname was and started using that I was able to find people who knew him. And so how people are named is a real key. The databases are wonderful and there's more and more information coming online.
In addition to what Esther just said, when you go to a place like Poland, one of my sister Evelyn and I took one of these trips back to our parents' hometowns. And one of the nicest things we learned in Poland is that there's a whole infrastructure of people who are there and they're not Jewish, but they're there to help Jews find their relatives. And some of them are remarkable. We had guides who took us around, and they did some of the research for us. They found a telephone book that indicated that my father had relatives who owned a tavern in Borynia, which is now in Ukraine, and another Berger relative had a lumber mill of some sort. Who knew? My father rarely spoke about his hometown for his own reasons, for understandable reasons. So those are a real good resource as well. And as I think Esther said, talk to as many people as you can. You'll find out all kinds of things.
Right, and I'd offer my email, my personal email, which is, are you going to make that available, or I'll give it to you, everybody now anyway. If you have any questions, every time I've done an event like this, someone will get in touch with me. Does this photograph show up at all? Wait a minute. You really can't see it.
chat, but yes, we can
Yeah,
see.
you really can't see it, but everywhere I've gone, every time I've spoken, people will get in touch with me and ask me about Feldefig or Landsberg or this or that. It's D Nasaw, DNASAW @gc.cuny.edu. D Nasaw @gc for Graduate Center .cuny.edu. And I'd be happy to help out. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has extraordinary stuff. YIVO has extraordinary material. It is possible to do this work. It's not easy, but it's possible to do it.
Another trip, Joe talked about going back to the shtetls or the other cities. It's very important to get the right guide, if you will, somebody who believes in what you're doing, not somebody who's just going to take you there and show you around the main square. The person that I had hired, in the media business, you'd call her a fixer. She went ahead to meet people, to find the oldest people in town who we could talk to, so that when we came, it wasn't just going into town and wandering around. So it's really important to do some research in advance of the trips.
Thank you all. Let me, we just have 2 minutes, so let me close with sort of a two-part question. The first is for David, and then the other part, I think it'd be great for each of you to answer. Part one is, did the US government ever issue a formal apology for its treatment of Jewish refugees during this time? And then part two for each of you is, what the question from Lorraine is, do you think the Americans learned their lessons from how we treated refugees after the war? I might reframe that and say, what do each of you see as the lessons of this story that you want to leave with the audience?
No, there was no apology. Anthony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, has made an apology of sorts for the State Department's anti-Semitism, which is, egregious. But no formal apology has ever been given. I would hope the legacy would be that the American people have to hold their Congress responsible, have to hold their elected officials responsible for doing the right thing when it's clear what the right thing is, and for not formulating immigration policy on big lies, which is what happened to keep the Jews out after World War II.
When I saw the Mexican families being separated at the border, I mean, that reminded me of the kinds of things that I felt the Jews had been put through. I don't know how to solve the immigration dilemma, and it is a puzzle that's really hard to answer. But that is not a solution, and what happened after the war teaches us.
Right.
Can help us reflect on how we can approach these issues with a little more humanity.
So I would say that I unfortunately, I'm not sure we've learned very much. What we see going on in the world, and genocides with immigration issues, but I hope that these stories will bring some humanity to some of the people who are listening, who will try to act. And like Joe, when I see these children at the border, I see myself, except I was lucky. My father figured out how to forge documents. But yeah, sure, Joe and I see ourselves in those children and feel so lucky that we made it. And our hearts go out to all of those children and those refugees.
Well, what an important and beautiful note to end on. A huge thank you to each of you, Esther, David, and Joe, both for your time this evening and also for all that you've each contributed to public discourse on this topic. You've educated so many. And to our audience, there is so much more to learn. We'll continue to host programs about this topic, and we hope you will order our panelists' books, which we put links to in the chat for a deeper dive into this. everything that we do with the museum is made possible through donor support. So to those of you in the audience who have supported us, you have our deepest thanks. And to everyone who hasn't, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum if you're able. We do host a lot of programs, and I'll just mention now 2 that are sort of related to the discussion tonight. There's a terrific artist named Jacqueline Cotwall in Chicago. Her parents were survivors and DPs who came to Canada in 1949. And she has this series called Growing Up Jewish Art and Storytelling about her experience growing up with that story in her household and how it shaped her. So we have this, it's an artist talk next Tuesday, May 11th. I think it'll be really interesting, and we hope you'll join us. And then we also have a conversation about a month from now with Menachem Rosensaft, who was in the DP camp and has been a real leader of the 2G community, about his perspective on the second generation. So we hope you'll join us for that as well, and everything else that we have going on. But that aside, we're grateful for you guys tuning in tonight, and Esther, David, and Joe, big thanks for sharing your time and expertise.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Have a good evening, everyone.